I paid $120,000 for a family trip to Maui, a trip to scatter my late wife's ashes in the ocean where we had honeymooned 50 years before. I paid for the first-class seats, the oceanfront suites, and the entire new wardrobe my daughter-in-law swore she could not travel without. And then, at the airport, standing at the desk while the others waited, my son turned and told me, quite calmly, that he had never bought my ticket at all, and that I should simply go on home. The whole thing had been arranged from the start to strand me there. What they did not know, what they could not have imagined, was that the urn I had placed so trustingly into their hands did not hold my wife at all, and that the quiet, tired old pilot they thought they had discarded had already seen the whole betrayal coming and quietly taken back control of everything that mattered. By the next day, their perfect trip and their secret plan had both come apart in their hands. Before I tell you exactly how, do an old man a kindness. Take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment telling me what town you are watching from tonight. It means the world to know how far these stories travel. Now let me start at the beginning. One honest note before we begin. This story is a work of fiction. The voice you are hearing and the images you are seeing are AI-assisted. Names, places, and events are invented for storytelling. Any resemblance to real people is purely coincidental. But the lessons about family, greed, and quiet strength are very real. Now, let us begin. My name is Gene Marlowe. I am 71 years old, and I live outside Portland, Oregon. Under gray skies, I have loved my whole life. For 38 years, I was an airline captain. I flew everything from small propeller planes out of mountain airstrips to wide-body jets across the Pacific. And I carried, over those decades, hundreds of thousands of souls up into the sky and brought every one of them safely back down to the earth. There is a thing that a career like that builds into the marrow of a man, and it is the single most important thing about this whole story, so I want you to understand it before I go any further. A pilot learns, through long and serious training, to do the exact opposite of what fear tells him to do. When something goes wrong at 35,000 feet, every animal instinct in your body screams at you to panic, to react, to grab the controls and yank. And a trained pilot learns to do none of those things. He learns to breathe, to go quiet and cold and clear, to trust his instruments over his terror, and to work the checklist calmly, one item at a time, all the way to a safe landing. I spent 38 years learning to stay calm inside the emergency. It saved a great many lives over the years. In the end, it saved mine. I remember a night over the Pacific, decades ago, in weather so violent that the airplane bucked like a living thing trying to throw us off, and a young co-pilot beside me who had frozen at the controls, his knuckles white, his breath coming in gasps. I remember reaching over, very calmly, and saying the words they teach you to say. Aviate, navigate, communicate, in that order. And watching him come back to himself, one word at a time. We landed that plane. Every soul aboard walked off into the terminal to hug the people waiting for them, never knowing how close it had been. The co-pilot thanked me afterward, shaking, and asked how I stayed so calm. I told him the truth. I told him I was just as frightened as he was. The difference was only that I had trained myself over 10,000 hours not to let the fear touch my hands. That is not courage. Courage is for people who feel no fear. This was something better and more reliable, a discipline. And a discipline can be learned, and it can be leaned on, long after the courage has drained away. There is a second thing flying teaches you, and it belongs beside the first. It teaches you to trust the instruments over your own feelings. There is a deadly phenomenon in aviation where a pilot's inner sense of which way is up becomes completely, confidently wrong, especially in cloud or darkness, and every fiber of his being insists the plane is level when the instruments plainly show it is in a diving turn toward the ground. Pilots have flown perfectly good airplanes into the sea because they trusted the lie their feelings told them over the truth their instruments showed them. So we are trained, relentlessly, to believe the instruments, to believe the cold data even when it contradicts the warm and confident feeling in our gut. That discipline, the willingness to believe what the evidence shows me rather than what I wish were true, is the reason I am telling you this story from a position of peace instead of ruin. Because when the instruments of my own life began to show me a truth I did not want to believe about my own son, I made myself, at great cost, believe them. I built my life with my wife Colette, and she was my clear sky. We married young, just before I earned my wings, and for 50 years she was the fixed point I flew home to from every corner of the world. We honeymooned in Maui, 2 kids with no money who saved for a year for a few days in a cheap room a mile from the beach. And we stood on the sand at sunset, and Colette told me that when she died, whenever that was, she wanted to come back to that water, to be scattered into that same ocean where we had begun. She said it lightly, the way you say such things when you are young and death is a rumor. She said it again, not lightly at all, in the last months of her life, when the cancer had made death a fact in the room with us. "Promise me the ocean, Jean," she said. "Promise me Maui." And I promised. When she passed, a little over a year ago, keeping that promise became the last and most sacred duty of my life. In those final months, when we both knew where things were heading, Colette and I talked more honestly than most couples ever get the chance to. She was not afraid, or if she was, she hid it to spare me, the way she had spared me 1,000 smaller things across 50 years. What she cared about, at the end, was not herself, but the people she was leaving, and above all, our son. She held my hand one night near the end and said, "Jean, promise me you will not let being alone make you foolish. Promise me you will keep your eyes open." She had seen, more clearly than I had, the way Shane and that woman looked at us, at what we had, and she was trying, even dying, to warn me. I promised her I would be careful, and then I promptly, in my grief, forgot the promise almost entirely, and let my loneliness make me exactly as foolish as she had feared. It was only when the instruments began to whisper that I finally remembered her warning and understood that my wife had tried to protect me from beyond the grave, and that I owed it to her to finally listen. I have one son. His name is Shane, and he is 36, and telling the truth about him is the hardest landing I have ever had to make. Shane was a sweet, easy boy who grew into a soft, drifting man. He had his mother's warmth, but none of her spine, and I was gone too much, up in the sky for days at a time, to teach him the discipline that might have given him one. He never found his own altitude. He drifted from job to job and from scheme to scheme, always chasing an easy updraft, always a little resentful of the men who worked harder and rose higher. Colette worried about him to the end. She would say that we had loved him soft, and she was right. And I have had to live with the knowledge that a father who taught strangers' children to fly failed to teach his own son how to stand. I have turned that failure over more times than I can count, looking for the exact place I went wrong, the way you study a flight recording after an incident to find the precise moment the trouble began. And I always land in the same spot. It was not one big mistake. It was 10,000 small absences. I was a good pilot, which meant I was gone, 4 days here, a week there, crossing oceans while Colette raised our boy largely alone. I told myself I was providing, building the security that would let him thrive. And I was. But a boy does not need his father's paycheck nearly as much as he needs his father's presence, his example, the daily, unspectacular work of being shown how a man carries himself. I gave Shane comfort, and I gave him money, and I gave him 1,000 things I bought in airports to make up for being away. And I did not give him the one thing that would have made him strong, which was myself, steadily, over years. You cannot fly around the world and raise a son at the same time. I tried. The son is the part that crashed. That failure is mine, and I do not hide from it. And it is the ground beneath everything that happened. His wife, Kayla, was the crosswind that finally pushed him off course for good. She came into his life a few years back, beautiful and sharp and hungry, and she read my soft, rudderless son in an instant, the way a predator reads the weakest animal in the herd. Within a year, she had her hands on every control surface of his life. She decided where they lived and what they drove, and most importantly, how they regarded me, which was as a resource, an old man with a paid-off house and a pilot's pension and savings, whose main remaining purpose was to fund the lifestyle she believed she deserved. She never called me Dad. She called me Gene in a flat, cool tone on the rare occasions she addressed me at all. And through Shane, gently and then not so gently, the requests for money began, and grew, and became expectations. And I paid, and paid, because I was a grieving widower who did not want to lose the last of his family, and because paying was easier than facing what my paying was teaching them. This is the quiet trap that catches so many of us who came up hard and did well, and I want to name it plainly for anyone listening who is caught in it now. When you have money and someone you love does not, giving becomes the easiest thing in the world, easier than a hard conversation, easier than a firm no, easier than watching them struggle. And so you give, and it feels like love, and for a while it even functions like love. But money given to a person who has not learned to earn it does not teach them gratitude. It teaches them expectation. Every gift quietly redraws the line of what they believe they are owed, so that the next gift is not a kindness, but a debt you are paying, and the one after that is overdue. I paid and paid, and told myself I was being a good father, and what I was actually doing, one comfortable check at a time, was training my son and his wife to see me not as a man to be loved, but as an account to be drawn upon. I built that expectation with my own hands, and then acted shocked when they came to collect. The trip was Kayla's idea, and I have to hand it to her. It was a masterstroke of cruelty, because it took the most sacred thing in my life and turned it into a weapon aimed at my wallet and my dignity both. She came to me, all soft eyes and gentle concern, and said that the family needed to heal, that we had never properly grieved Colette together, and that we should take one last beautiful family trip to Maui, all of us, to finally scatter Mom's ashes in the ocean she loved, the way she had wanted. For a moment, hearing my son's wife speak my wife's dying wish back to me, I was so moved that I wept. It sounded like grace. It sounded like the family coming together at last around the woman who had held us all. I said yes before she had finished asking, and in saying yes, I stepped directly into the trap she had built out of my own grief, which is the cruelest kind of trap there is. There is a particular genius to using a person's grief against them, and I have thought since about how well Kayla understood it. Grief scrambles the instruments. A grieving person cannot think straight, cannot weigh things properly, is desperate for meaning and connection, and for the pain to be given some shape and purpose. A predator who understands this can lead a grieving person almost anywhere, simply by dressing the trap in the language of healing and honor and closure. Every defense I might have raised, Kayla had preemptively disarmed by wrapping her scheme in Colette's memory, so that to question the cost was to question my love for my dead wife. To hesitate was to dishonor her. It was masterfully done, and it very nearly worked, and it would have worked completely on a man who was only grieving. What she did not account for was that I was not only a grieving husband, I was also a trained professional whose entire career had been built on the discipline of not being ruled by his feelings, even the most overwhelming ones. And that discipline, in the end, was the one instrument her scheme could not fool. The costs began to climb the moment I agreed, the way they always did with Kayla, each new expense presented as essential to honoring Colette properly. It could not be an ordinary trip, not for such a sacred occasion. It had to be first class because Mom would have wanted us comfortable. It had to be the oceanfront suites at the finest resort because we could not scatter Mom's ashes and then go back to some cheap room. Kayla needed an entirely new wardrobe because there would be photographs, and we had to look right for Colette. Bit by bit, the price of my wife's memorial climbed past $100,000, and I paid every invoice, because how do you haggle over your own wife's farewell? And Kayla knew, precisely, that I could not. She had weaponized my grief so expertly that every objection I might have raised would have felt like a betrayal of Colette. So I stayed silent, and I paid, and the total crossed $120,000, and I told myself it was worth any price to keep my promise to the ocean. I want to be fair and say that there was real feeling underneath my foolishness, not just weakness. I genuinely wanted that trip. I wanted, so badly it ached, to stand on that beach with my son and my grandchildren and give Colette back to the water together, as a family, the way she would have wanted. I wanted one last beautiful thing to come out of all that loss. That longing was real and good and human, and Kayla read it precisely and used it against me. Which is what makes what she did so much worse than ordinary theft. A thief takes your money. She took my longing to honor my dead wife and turned it into a lever to empty my accounts and steal my home. There is a special kind of cold in a person who can look at a widower's love for his late wife and see in it only a weakness to be exploited. I did not fully understand until all of this that such people truly exist, walking among us, wearing the faces of family. Now I know, and I would rather have learned it than gone on being the fool who did not. But here is where 38 years in the cockpit began quietly to save me. Somewhere in the middle of all that paying, my instruments started to disagree with my feelings. My feelings said this was a grieving family healing together. My instruments, the cold data of a careful man, began to show me small readings that did not fit that story. There was the strange over-insistence on my paying for everything up front, in cash, transferred directly to Shane rather than booked in my own name. There was a document Shane brought me one evening, folded to a signature line that he wanted me to sign quickly without reading. Something about the trip, he said, a liability waiver for the scattering ceremony. And when I said I would read it later, a flash of real irritation crossed his face before he smoothed it away. small readings. Each one alone was nothing. But a pilot is trained to notice when several small instruments all drift the same wrong direction at once, because that pattern, that quiet agreement among the gauges, is how a real emergency announces itself long before you can feel it. Let me explain what I mean, because it is the heart of how I survived this. In an aircraft, catastrophes rarely arrive as a single dramatic bang. Far more often, they announce themselves as a scatter of small, unremarkable discrepancies. A gauge reading a little off, a switch that feels slightly wrong, a sound at the edge of hearing. Each one easy to dismiss on its own. The pilots who die are the ones who dismiss them one at a time, who find an innocent explanation for each single reading, and never step back to see that all the little wrongnesses are pointing, together, at one big wrongness gathering just out of sight. The pilots who live are the ones trained to feel that cold prickle when the small things start to cluster, to trust the pattern even when no single piece of it is alarming. That cold prickle is what I felt around Shane and Kayla in those weeks. The sense of small, wrong readings quietly agreeing with one another. And 38 years had taught me never, ever to ignore it. I did not yet know what the emergency was. I only knew with professional certainty that one was coming. So I did what I have done in every cockpit of my life when the instruments start to whisper. I did not panic, and I did not ignore them. I ran the checklist. Quietly, over the following days, telling no one, I began to verify the actual state of my own life the way I would verify the actual state of an aircraft before I trusted it with 200 souls. I pulled my financial records. I reviewed my accounts. And because that folded document with the signature line had lodged in my mind like a warning light I could not switch off, I drove down to the county recorder's office and I pulled the records on my own house, the house Colette and I had paid off and lived in for 40 years. And there, sitting in the public record, filed just 3 weeks earlier, was the answer to every whispering instrument. A quitclaim deed, transferring my house to my son and his wife, bearing a signature meant to look like mine. I had not signed it. They had forged it. I sat in my truck in that parking lot for a long time, and I did the hardest thing my training ever asked of me, which was to keep believing the instruments, even as my whole heart screamed that they had to be wrong. He was my son. This was the boy I had taught to read a compass, whose small hand I had held on his very first flight, who had once dozed off against my shoulder at 10,000 feet. Every warm feeling I had insisted this could not be what it looked like, that there was an explanation, that no son would do this to his father. But the document in my hands was cold, hard data, and I had spent 38 years training myself to believe the data over the comforting lie, because the pilots who believe the comforting lie fly into the ground. So I made myself believe it. My son and his wife had forged my name to steal my home, and the sacred trip to scatter my wife's ashes was the cover, the distraction, the beautiful grief-shaped smokescreen behind which they were quietly stealing everything I had. I kept running the checklist because one bad reading demands a full inspection, and what the full inspection revealed was a scheme far larger and colder than a single forged deed. Piece by piece, I assembled it. The trip was not merely a distraction. It was a machine with several purposes. It extracted $120,000 from me in a form I could not easily trace or recover. It got me to a place, emotionally, where I would sign things without reading them. And, I came to understand, it was designed to isolate me and to build a narrative. Because a man who has just been left behind at an airport, who is grieving and alone and confused, is a man who can be painted later to a court or a doctor as fragile, declining, no longer fit to manage his own affairs. The forged deed was step one. Having me declared unable to handle my own life so they could seize the rest was step two. They had not planned merely to rob me. They had planned to erase me gently behind a curtain of fake compassion. I want to tell you what that did to me the moment I understood the whole shape of it, because I think it matters. I did not rage. I have never once raged in a cockpit, and this was the worst emergency of my life, and the discipline held. But something in me, some last warm thread of illusion about my son, went cold and quiet and final. They had taken the most sacred thing I had, my promise to scatter Colette in her ocean, and they had turned it into the bait in a trap to destroy me. They had used my dead wife as a lure. And in doing that, they had told me, more clearly than any words ever could, exactly who they had decided to be. So I stopped grieving the son I thought I had, at least for the moment. And I did the thing a captain does when the aircraft is in a genuine emergency. I set my feelings aside, off to one side where they could not touch the controls, and I began, calmly and methodically, to fly the plane. There is an old saying among pilots that, in an emergency, the first thing you should do is wind your watch. It sounds absurd, but the wisdom in it is profound. It means, before you do anything, take a breath, slow down, refuse to let the panic set the pace. The single greatest killer in aviation is not fire or weather or mechanical failure. It is a startled human being reacting too fast, doing the wrong thing quickly instead of the right thing calmly. So when the full shape of my son's betrayal came clear to me, I did the equivalent of winding my watch. I made a cup of coffee. I sat down at my kitchen table. I let my heart rate come down. And only then, when I was calm and clear and cold, did I begin to work the problem. In order, one item at a time, the way I had worked 100 emergencies at altitude. Panic would have had me confronting Shane that very night, blowing up the whole family in a burst of righteous fury and accomplishing nothing but to warn my enemy. Discipline had me quietly winding my watch, and then quietly, methodically, taking back control of my aircraft. The first item on my checklist was the one that mattered most, and it was not the money, and it was not even the house. It was Colette. Because the same cold clarity that let me see their scheme also forced me to face a terrible question. If these were the people who had forged my name and planned to erase me, were these the people I was going to trust to carry my wife's ashes across an ocean and scatter them, with love, into the water she had chosen? The answer, the moment I let myself ask it, was obvious and absolute. No. I would not trust Colette to their hands. I could not. A woman who would weaponize my grief for a real man's ashes would think nothing of turning the scattering itself into a photo opportunity, a performance, a thing done for a camera and not for love. So I made a quiet, strange, and I believe sacred decision. I would not give them Colette. I went to my attorney next, a sharp and steady woman named Rosa Herrera, and I laid the whole inspection report in front of her, the forged deed, the financial trail, the pattern. She was, in her professional way, appalled, and then she was, in her professional way, delighted. Because a forged deed is not a subtle crime, and a man who catches it before it is used holds every card. Over the next 2 weeks, quietly, while my son and his wife happily planned the resort meals for a trip they believed had already defeated me, Rosa and I did our work. We prepared everything to void the forged deed the instant it was ever used, with my testimony and a handwriting analysis ready to prove the forgery beyond any doubt. And we moved my house and the rest of my estate into a protected trust, locked behind a wall of law that no forged signature could ever cross again. By the time the trip arrived, the home they thought they were stealing was already, permanently, beyond their reach. They just did not know it yet. Rosa asked me during those 2 weeks of quiet preparation why I did not simply confront them, report the forgery to the police at once, have it done with. And I gave her the answer 38 years of flying had taught me. I told her that you do not react to an emergency the instant you detect it. You first make sure you understand it completely, and you position the aircraft for the safest possible outcome. And only then do you act, decisively, all at once. If I had confronted them the moment I found the forged deed, I would have had my dramatic moment of righteousness, and they would have scattered, covered their tracks, spun their story, and lived to prey on me or someone else another day. By staying quiet, by letting them believe right up until the end that their plan was working perfectly, I kept them exactly where I could see them, while I calmly built the wall they would break themselves against. The loud, satisfying move and the correct move are almost never the same move. I had learned that lesson at altitude, where the wrong move kills you, and it served me on the ground, where the wrong move would only have cost me everything. And then I prepared the urn. I bought a second urn, a beautiful one, better looking than the simple one that actually held my wife, and I filled it with ash and fine soil from Colette's own garden, from the beds of roses she had tended for 40 years, which felt, in a strange way, like the least dishonest substitution I could make, since it was at least a piece of something she had loved and grown. I sealed it, and I set it on the mantel where the real urn had been, and I moved Colette, my actual Colette, to a safe and private place that only I knew. If my son and his wife wanted to fly to Hawaii and perform a scattering for their cameras, they were welcome to scatter my wife's rose garden into the sea. The woman herself would remain exactly where she belonged, with the husband who had promised her the ocean, and who intended still to keep that promise, properly, in his own time, with his own hands. I sat with that decision for a long night before I made it final, because there was something in it that troubled me, a deception of my own woven into my defense against theirs. Was it wrong, I asked myself, to hand them a false urn? To let them carry out a scattering they did not know was hollow? I turned it over the way I turn over any hard call. And I decided, in the end, that it was not wrong, because the lie I was telling was in service of protecting something sacred from people who meant to desecrate it, while the lie they were telling was in service of robbing a grieving old man of his home and his dignity. There is a difference between the deception that guards a treasure and the deception that steals one. The same difference as between a locked door and a crowbar. I was locking a door. Colette would have understood completely. She always understood the difference between the rules that serve love and the rules that only serve appearances, and she would have wanted me to protect her from being turned into a prop in her own son's performance. The morning of the flight, I played my part, because a pilot who has decided to abort a takeoff does not announce it to the passengers until the moment is right. I let them load me up like a porter, dragging Kayla's enormous trunks through the terminal, while my own small bag hung forgotten on my shoulder. And I said nothing, and I watched. I had chosen not to know, consciously, exactly how they would leave me behind, because I wanted to see it, to have the final instrument reading confirmed by my own eyes before I acted. The way you confirm an engine failure by the gauges and the sound and the feel all at once before you shut it down. I did not have to wait long. At the counter, Shane laid down 4 passports where there should have been 5, and the agent, counting the people in front of her, frowned and said she saw 4 passengers booked, but 5 travelers standing there. Shane turned around then, and for the first time that whole morning, he looked me in the eye, and there was no confusion in his face and no shame, only a flat, rehearsed emptiness. And he told me, in a voice pitched with fake sorrow, that he was so sorry, that in all the stress of planning he had somehow forgotten to book my ticket, and that there was no time to fix it now, and that I should just head home, and they would handle the scattering and tell me all about it. Kayla did not even look up from her phone. My grandchildren looked confused and a little ashamed, and I stood there in that terminal, an old captain who had flown into that very airport 1,000 times, holding my dead wife's rose garden in a beautiful fake urn. And I understood that this was the moment, the deliberate, planned, rehearsed moment where my only son discarded me like an overweight bag to lighten his load. They had never intended to bring me. I had known it for 2 weeks. But knowing a thing and watching it land are different, and I will not pretend it did not cut me to the bone. People sometimes imagine that if you see a betrayal coming, it does not hurt when it lands. But that is not true at all. Knowing does not blunt the blow. If anything, it sharpens it, because you have to stand there and watch the people you love confirm with their own hands and their own cold eyes the very worst thing you suspected of them. And there is no relief in being right. I had known for 2 weeks that my son intended to abandon me at that airport. And when the moment came, when he actually turned and looked at me with that rehearsed, empty sorrow and told me to go home, some part of me, some small, stubborn, fatherly part that had refused all along to fully believe it, died right there on the terminal floor. I had held on to a thread of hope against all my own evidence that when the moment came, he would not be able to go through with it, that some memory of the boy he had been would stop his hand. It did not stop his hand. He went through with it easily. And that ease was the thing that truly broke my heart. I did not make a scene, because dignity is the one possession no one can take from you unless you hand it over, and I was not handing it over in a public terminal. I simply nodded as if I understood, as if it were a reasonable mistake, and I set the fake urn gently into Kayla's hands, and I told them to give Colette a beautiful goodbye. Then I turned and I walked back through that terminal alone, past the gates I had flown out of my whole career. And I drove myself home to an empty house. And somewhere on that quiet drive, the grief and the humiliation finished hardening into the cold, clear, purposeful calm I had felt in every real emergency of my life. The passengers had bailed out and left the captain alone in the cockpit. Very well. I have always preferred to fly the difficult approaches alone anyway. That is not entirely true, of course. No one truly prefers to be alone at the worst moment of their life. But there is a kind of grim comfort for a man built the way I am built in knowing that when everyone else has bailed out, the one person left in the cockpit is someone he can absolutely rely on. I had relied on myself in every real emergency of my career, and I knew, walking back through that terminal alone, that I could rely on myself now. My family had shown me, in the clearest possible terms, that I could not count on them, that their love was conditional and their loyalty for sale. Very well. It was a bitter thing to learn at 71. But there is a freedom in it, too. A clean, cold freedom. The freedom of a man who no longer has to wonder where he stands with the people around him, because they have told him plainly, and who can therefore stop hoping and start acting. I walked out of that airport with less family than I had walked in with, and more clarity than I had possessed in years. And on balance, God help me, it was not the worst trade I have ever made. I went home, and I picked up the checklist, and I began to bring it down. There was, in truth, very little left for me to do that day because I had done the real work in the 2 quiet weeks before, which is the whole secret of staying calm in an emergency. You do not rise to the occasion. You fall to the level of your preparation. The house was already in the trust. The forged deed was already documented and ready to be voided the instant it surfaced. My wife was already safe on her private shelf, the real Colette, while her rose garden flew west toward Maui in a stranger's luggage. All that remained was to let their plan meet the wall I had quietly built, and to watch, without anger, the way you watch a storm you have already flown around, as it broke over the people who had walked straight into it, believing the sky was clear. Their beautiful trip began to come apart almost immediately, though I only pieced the timeline together later. The scheme had depended on 100 small assumptions that were no longer true. Certain accounts they had counted on drawing from during the trip, accounts tied to the finances I had quietly restructured, no longer answered the way they expected. And when Shane, at some point during that lavish week, moved to actually record the forged deed and make the theft of my house official, he found that the property had been placed weeks earlier into a trust he could not touch by a father he had assumed was too broken and too foolish to protect himself. I am told that is roughly when the calls began. My phone back in Oregon filled over that day and the next with a rising flood of missed calls. First from Shane, then from Kayla, then from numbers I did not know. Dozens upon dozens of them. The frantic, escalating drumbeat of 2 people discovering that the helpless old mark they had left at an airport had quietly locked every door they meant to walk through. I did not answer a single one. But the calls, the money, the house, none of it was the part that broke them. The part that broke them was Colette. Because while their financial scheme was quietly collapsing back in Oregon, they went ahead on a beautiful Maui evening and they held their scattering. They gathered on a rented catamaran at sunset in Kayla's expensive new wardrobe, and they made a great and tearful performance of it. And they filmed all of it, and they poured the contents of that beautiful urn into the Pacific with theatrical grief, while a hired photographer captured every moment. And then they posted it, all of it, to the world. Long, weeping captions about honoring Mom, about family, about love and loss and closure. They scattered my wife's rose garden into the sea and told the entire world it was Colette, and they wept for the cameras over a box of garden soil. And they never once suspected that the woman they claimed to be honoring was sitting safe and quiet on a shelf in Oregon, 3,000 miles from their performance, with the only person who had ever truly loved her. I saw the posts, of course, the way you cannot help but see such things. And I want to be honest with you about what I felt, because it was not triumph. It was a deep and terrible sadness, and underneath it, a strange, quiet peace. Sadness because my son stood on that boat and wept crocodile tears over his own mother and felt, I am sure, nothing real at all. And a man who can perform that much grief while feeling that little is a truly lost soul. But peace, too, because I understood, watching that grotesque performance, that I had been completely right not to trust them with her. The sacred thing had not been desecrated because the sacred thing had never left my care. They had performed an empty ritual with an empty urn, and in doing so they had proven beyond all doubt that Colette had been right about them and that I had been right to protect her. My wife's true farewell was still ahead, still mine to give, still pure. They had scattered nothing but their own hearts into that ocean, and shown the whole world how empty those were. I did not share what I knew, not then. I let their performance stand, publicly, uncorrected for a while, and I want to explain why, because it was not cowardice, and it was not even mercy. It was patience. A man who has been trained to wait for the right moment does not spend his best card the instant he draws it. Let them post their weeping videos. Let them collect their sympathy from strangers. Let them believe for a few more days that they had gotten away with all of it. The money, the house, the abandonment, the sacred fraud. Every hour they spent congratulating themselves was an hour they were not covering their tracks, not preparing a defense, not suspecting that the old man they had discarded was sitting quietly in Oregon with a folder full of proof and a wife safe on a shelf. I had learned to let an advantage ripen. The moment to bring the truth down on them would come, and when it did, it would be complete, and it would be theirs to live with forever. There was no need to rush it. The truth keeps. They came home to consequences they could not have imagined. When they finally reached me, days later, and I finally let them into my house, they came not as conquerors, but as beggars. Shane weeping, Kayla white and silent for once. I laid it out for them calmly, the way I would brief a crew after a serious incident, without shouting and without cruelty, just the facts. I told them I knew about the forged deed. I told them the house had been in a protected trust for weeks and could never be theirs. I told them I had documentation of the entire scheme sitting with my attorney, ready for the district attorney whenever I chose. And then, when Shane was already broken, already sobbing that he was sorry, that Kayla had pushed him, that he had never meant it to go so far, I told him the last thing, the thing that finally silenced even Kayla. I told them that the ashes they had scattered on that boat, the ashes they had wept over for their thousands of followers, had not been Colette, that I had never trusted them with her, that they had performed their beautiful grief over a box of dirt from a garden, and that the wife and mother they claimed to honor had been home with me the entire time. I have never seen a silence like the one that filled my living room then. Kayla understood it first, understood the depth of the humiliation, that their entire public performance of grief had been a lie, photographed for the world, and that everyone who ever learned the truth would know them for exactly what they were. And Shane, my son, understood something worse and more personal. He understood that his own father had looked at him weeks before that airport and had judged him correctly to be a man who could not be trusted to carry his own mother's ashes with love. That is a terrible thing for a son to have to know about himself. And I did not say it to be cruel. I said it because it was true, and because he needed, finally, to see himself clearly, the way the instruments see, without the comforting fog of his own self-regard. He put his face in his hands and he wept. And this time, I believe, the tears were real. Because they were not for a camera. They were the first honest thing I had seen him do in years. I did not send my son to prison, though Rosa had the papers ready and the law would have supported it. I am his father, and whatever he had become, I had helped make him that way with my long absences and my soft, distant love. And I am too old to want my last years defined by my only child in a cell. But I did not rescue him either, and that distinction is the whole of what I have learned. I cut him and Kayla off completely and permanently from me and from everything I have, cleanly, through Rosa, with no anger and no door left ajar for manipulation. The house is safe. My money is safe. And Shane, at 36, is finally, for the first time in his life, standing on the bare ground of his own choices, with no wealthy father beneath him to catch his fall. Whether he becomes a man there, or simply a poorer version of what he already was, is no longer mine to determine. I gave him everything for 36 years, and it made him worse. The only thing I have left to give him is the consequences, and so, at last, I have given him those. And then, when it was all finished, I kept my promise. I booked a single ticket to Maui, one seat for one quiet old pilot, and I flew west across the Pacific I had crossed 1,000 times, carrying my wife in a simple urn in the seat beside me, the real Colette. Home at last on my shoulder, the way she used to fall asleep when we were young. I did not stay at a grand resort. I took a small room a mile from the beach, the way we had on our honeymoon 50 years before. 2 kids with no money and the whole sky ahead of them. And at sunset, on a quiet stretch of sand away from the crowds, I waded out into the warm water alone, and I opened the urn, and I gave my Colette to the ocean she had chosen, the right way, with my own hands, with no cameras and no performance and no one watching but the sinking sun. I told her I loved her. I told her I had kept our home safe. And I told her I was sorry it had taken so long, and that it was just the two of us, the way it had always really been. Then I stood in the surf until the light was gone, and I felt, for the first time since she died, something close to peace. I stayed on that island for several more days, alone, and I did something I had not done in longer than I could remember. I rested. I walked the beaches in the early morning before the crowds came. I ate simple meals and watched the sun go down over the water where I had just given my wife back to the sea. And slowly, over those quiet days, a lifetime of tension I had not even known I was carrying began to drain out of me. I had spent so many years bracing, providing, flying, worrying, holding everything up, and then a year grieving, and then weeks fighting for my own survival against my own child, that I had forgotten what it felt like simply to be still, to be at peace, to be a man with nothing left to defend and no one left to save. Colette was safe. My home was safe. My accounts were safe. And the people who would have taken all of it were 3,000 miles away, drowning in the consequences of their own choices. No longer any threat to me at all. For the first time in years, I had nowhere I had to be, and no one I had to carry. I sat on that beach, and I let myself at last simply rest. I think a great deal now, in the quiet of that safe old house, about instruments and feelings, because that is the whole of my old trade, and, it turns out, the whole of this story. For 38 years, I trained myself to believe the cold truth of the instruments over the warm and confident lie of my own gut. Because in the sky, that discipline is the difference between landing and dying. I never dreamed I would need it most on the ground. in my own family, in my own grief. But my feelings told me, right up to the end, that my son could not possibly be doing what he was doing. And the instruments told me plainly that he was. And I survived because I made myself believe the instruments. That is the hardest thing I know how to teach, and the most important. When the people you love show you cold, hard evidence of who they truly are, believe the evidence, even when your heart insists on the comforting lie. The heart, in the fog, will fly you straight into the sea. This is a work of fiction, and the voice you have been listening to is not a living man. But the lesson underneath it is as real as the sky. My son and his wife looked at a grieving old pilot and saw a broken instrument, a man to be discarded at a gate and erased behind a curtain of fake compassion. And they were so certain of his weakness that they used his own dead wife as the bait in their trap. They never once considered that a man who spends his life staying calm inside emergencies, who trusts the cold truth over the comforting feeling, is the most dangerous person in the world to underestimate, precisely because he does not panic and he does not tip his hand. He simply, quietly, flies the plane down to a safe landing while everyone else is screaming. Never mistake a calm man for a weak one, and never assume that the old pilot in the back has forgotten how to fly. They wanted my inheritance. In the end, the only thing they inherited was the ruin they built with their own hands. My name is Gene Marlowe, and the promise I made my wife and the home we built, I carried through the storm myself and landed them both safely, alone.